Hello and welcome to another Atypical Philosopher video. Today I'm going to speak to you about shock horror, atheism. Thank you for joining me. If anyone is indeed joining me live, but I'm sure you'll see this, well, if you're literally listening to these words, you are watching this or listening to this in some way at some point in time. So thanks for that. I've got a few interviews lined up. I've got one tonight that won't be going out on my YouTube channel, but David Fitzgerald's podcast is interviewing me about the resurrection, a critical examination, which is a book that he provided the forward to. The resurrection, a critical examination of the Easter story. So that'll be the topic for tonight's conversation. But I haven't got any live interviews going on this week. I've just got two that I'm doing for other people. So that's why I thought I'd pop along and do a live now and say hello. And I'm going to talk about atheism and why I am an atheist. There are lots of reasons why I'm an atheist. And so actually this conversation could go in all sorts of different directions. And in fact, I don't want to, I am spamming the video again, but I recently produced a book called Why I Am Atheist and Not a Theist, How to Do Knowledge, Meaning and Morality in a Godless World. And the reason I want to do that is, as I keep saying, I wanted to set my worldview up from the bottom and build it up into a coherent, wall of reason, such that I'm working towards atheism rather than starting with atheism and working backwards. So, stripping away what I thought I knew and saying, right, how do we start by understanding what the building bricks of reality are? And then how do we work out epistemology, how we know things? And then how do we work out natural theology, whether God exists? Hello from Texas, where Jesus is indeed very popular. So that's where, that's who I'm talking to, by the way. And so working through natural theology and then onto sort of morality and how this affects, I missed out teleology, which is purpose and meaning and purpose, how we develop meaning and purpose in the absence of a God. We create that for ourselves. And then going on to and say, well, where does this take morality? And my atheistic worldview, and I'm sure lots of people say this, but I am really confident that my worldview is true by point of fact that there are no missing bricks in my wall. Like, I don't go to sleep at night thinking, do you know what? I'm missing something. How does that work? Oh, I don't really, and having that nagging feeling that my worldview isn't completely solid and really struggling with any area. I don't struggle with any area of my worldview. And that's not through sort of blind faith or a sense of confidence that is not warranted, an unjustified belief that, oh, how wonderful is my thinking. But I'm genuinely really happy with how I've worked out how everything works and what my views are philosophically of everything, to the point where I don't have any gaps. There are a few gaps in knowledge, but gaps in knowledge doesn't mean you throw everything, your baby out with the bathwater. Just because I don't know 100% how consciousness works in a naturalistic world, actually, I don't know how consciousness would work in a theistic world either. Like, I just don't know how consciousness works fully, like no one does. And so but what I don't do is suddenly go, oh my goodness, it's God. And so, the same with the start of the universe. I don't know 100% what's going on at the start of the universe because the laws of physics break down at that moment. And I don't just throw everything up in the air and go, oh, God did it. That's no more a sensible option than, well, in fact, it's far less a sensible option than naturalism explains it. And I use the horse racing analogy I always use, and you probably heard this before, which is, naturalism has supplanted supernaturalism. And we can, use that as a synonym for God. So naturalism has replaced supernaturalism thousands of times throughout history. We used to think lightning was Thor getting angry, and we used to think this, and we used to think that. And then as we understood the world more and more, naturalism replaced supernaturalism as a way of explaining reality. But the reverse has never happened. So supernaturalism has never replaced naturalism. And I know I've got a question here. I'll come to that in a second. So why would we think that something we don't fully understand, like consciousness or the beginning of the universe, why do we think supernaturalism would supply that answer, given that it's never supplanted naturalism? It's never won that race against the horse of naturalism ever before. So if we are using inductive reasoning, which is looking at past observations and building up an account and a prediction of what will happen going forward, then naturalism as a horse has won every single race and supernaturalism has won no races. And so therefore we have good inductive reasoning to believe that supernaturalism will supply the answer for how consciousness works and the beginning of the universe. And even if we never actually find those reasons, we are still justified in believing that naturalism is a far more likely answer than supernaturalism. So, and that's really, really important. Let's go for a question. I mean, I don't know if I can, without doing a little bit of research, whether I can definitely answer this. So which approach to abductive atheology, arguing for atheism, do you think is superior? Taking a Bayesian approach like Paul Draper does, or taking a theoretical virtues approach like Paul Draper? So inference to the best reason, which is sort of abduction, or do we look at actual evidence and say, actually, so that is really relevant to what I was just saying, which is if we look at say evidence and say, well, evidence has shown that naturalism, when we looked at past data, naturalism has won that race every time. So we can form a prediction of the future using a sort of Bayesian analysis, which is probability analysis, saying, well, if this has happened all the times in the past, then this is very likely to happen going forward. Then we can sort of generate a Bayesian approach to how that might work. Or do we use sort of arguments such as, deductive arguments that might sort of say, well, God definitely exists, God doesn't exist, and all these kind of things? What's the best approach? And I would say just a bit of everything. I would say, so some people don't think deductive arguments work particularly well because otherwise, if they did, no one would believe in God, because you'd have or vice versa. So there are obviously problems with deductive arguments. Take, for example, the problem of evil argument. So the problem of evil argument, let's get it up here, actually. Let's share the problem of evil. And I will just talk about that for a second, because I think this is probably a good example of what goes on when theists come across the problem of evil. So here's the Wikipedia page for the problem of evil. The most basic one, the logical problem of evil. So this is talking about a deductive argument. So this is a deductive argument, is where you're using logic to basically prove something, rather than every swan I've ever seen is white, therefore all swans are white, which is an inductive argument, but it might not work, because if you come across a black swan, then suddenly you're wrong. It doesn't conclusively show you that there is no such thing as a swan that is not white. So but a deductive argument should do that job. But the problem is, theists move God around like a pea underneath a shell in the kind of con artist game. And so when you start disproving this version of God, then they reinvent God to mean something else. But here's an example of a sort of move that theists do, which is the logical problem of evil. Premise one, this is the most basic form of it, and it can be, as you can see below, it can be made far more complex. But let's just take, for example, the most basic version, which is, if an omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omniscient God exists, all powerful, all loving, and all knowing, then evil does not. So if you accept that, then it follows that there is evil in the world. Okay, well, no, it doesn't follow, but you then make the next premise: there is evil in this world. So if there's evil, therefore an omnipotent, omnibenevolent, and omniscient God does not exist. So therefore, in this way, if that works, then God doesn't exist, if you accept premise one. But then theists would say, well, actually, you can have a scenario where God exists and there is evil. But what they have to then show is so the logical problem of evil doesn't work as well as people like to think it might work. So what happens is people develop, theists develop theodicies, which is to say, there are reasons why evil must exist or suffering must exists, and this, they appeal to skeptical theism often, which is like, I don't know the mind of God, I don't know how, I don't know the reasonings, but there could be an argument, right? So there could be a reason that suffering exists and an all-loving God exists. We just don't know that reason. And then you say, okay, actually, fair enough, you're right. So logically, there is not a true logical incompatibility between suffering existing and an all-loving God existing. Okay, I'll accept that. But what that means is, as a theist, you have to justify every single piece of suffering in the universe. And it's necessary as well. So if you have an all-loving God, this is either necessary right now for some greater good, or it's necessary for this great destination that this world is on the way to, and there's no better way of getting there than producing this suffering. But the problem is, you then have to, let's take it to the most absurd level, is not only are you having to justify, tsunamis killing 240,000 people, malaria, pandemics, wars, genocide, all these kind of things, but stubbing your toe in the morning, waking up, getting up, walking downstairs, stubbing your toe on the table. That piece, that unit of suffering cannot be gratuitous, because if it is gratuitous, which means if there's no reason for it, if it's unnecessary, then it is showing that God could have stopped that because it's not necessary, but hasn't stopped it. Therefore, that piece of suffering is gratuitous, which means that God is not omnibenevolent. So theists have to say, well, they just throw their hands up in the air and invoke skeptical theism, which is, there must be a reason. I don't know what it is. I don't know the mind of God. God moves in mysterious ways. There you go. That's the end. And I don't think that's good enough. So, and I think, so the evidential problem of evil says, well, let's assign some kind of probability to this. So given the thesis, the hypothesis of atheism, given the hypothesis of theism, what does all this suffering from a stub toe up to sort of genocide and tsunamis and malaria, what does this most probably support? What's the most likely hypothesis? Does it really add? Does this work as evidence for theism, all this suffering, or does it work as evidence for atheism? And I would say the latter, definitely. I would say, probabilistically, atheism is you have to jump through hoops to justify every single unit of suffering if you are going to be a theist who believes in omni God. And the other thing that theists do is just, as I say, do some kind of sleight of hand trick where they change the definition of what God is. Say, okay, well, God doesn't have divine foreknowledge, and humans have free will, and God doesn't know. This is called open theism. God doesn't know the result of freely willed decisions. Then you start changing the definition of God, and God starts looking a little bit different to what's in the Bible, or what's here and what's there, or how we might logically argue to God. And it's just like, it seems just a bit dodgy, and you're constantly changing God to solve one argument, but then you create other arguments, and then these eventually, your version of God then just disagrees with some of the arguments you've made, and you just get yourself in a complete mess. Real Atheology just talked about who was it? It was Graham Oppy and Paul Draper. Here's a quote from Graham Oppy, who says, "The naturalist does not have beliefs in anything over and above the things the theist believes in. From the standpoint of the naturalist, the theistic beliefs of the theist are pure addition. And from the standpoint of the theist, the naturalistic beliefs of the naturalist are pure subtraction. In short, naturalism is a simpler theory than theism." So I'm so glad he brought up Graham Oppy, because this is one of the points I really wanted to make today. A central premise of my argument in support of atheism is a principle of parsimony. The general principle states that if there are two competing theories and one is simpler than the other, then unless the more complex theory provides a better explanation of something than the simpler theory, one should endorse the simpler theory. And I think that's really important. He goes on to write, whatever range of options is open to the theist to explain the existence of God, exactly the same range of options is open to the naturalist to explain the existence of the universe. So what I was going to come on to say is, and I use this point in my book on the Kalam cosmological argument, which is the argument that theists used that God created the universe, which is say everything has a cause for its existence. The universe had a cause. Everything that exists has a cause for its existence. Anything that begins to exist has a cause for its existence. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause for its existence. Sorry, it's been a long time since I've thought about that. And that's the argument for God, or at least for a cause of the universe there, and that's being God. I would say that the universe existing as a brute fact is simpler as an argument or a scenario than God plus the universe. So if you're saying that God is necessary in all possible, God is just necessary, and contingent, the universe is created and is contingent upon God, then you're saying, right, I've got this thing God, which is quite, people say divine simplicity and all this, but actually you're having to build this kind of idea of God and make this thing fit with all of the data we have on Earth and in the universe. And you build up this abstract idea of God, and you say, right, that explains the universe. So we have God plus a universe, and that is everything, or God plus multiple universes, that is everything. Whereas the naturalist goes, why bother with the God bit? We just start with the universe, that is everything, or multiple universes, that is everything. And so actually it's simpler. And it's this, why, and this is what Graham Oppy is saying here. So if it is open to the theist to say that God exists of necessity, then it is open to the naturalist to say that the universe exists of necessity. If it is open to the theist to say that God's existence involves an infinite regress, then it is open to the naturalist to say that the existence of the universe involves an infinite regress. If it is open to the theist to say that the existence of God has no explanation, then it is open to the naturalist to say that the existence of the universe has no explanation. Insofar as we are interested in explaining the existence of the universe, the postulation of a God who creates a universe does not bring with it any explanatory advantage. And that is essentially one of the main things I wanted to talk about today. That this idea that Occam's razor, this is called, that you wouldn't, you don't want to multiply entities unnecessarily. If your hypothesis does the same explanatory job as another hypothesis, a simpler hypothesis. So basically, the fewer entities that you have in an explanatory hypothesis, the better, if it does the same job as another hypothesis that you're evaluating. So this is what Oppy's saying, is that the naturalism on Occam's razor does the same job as explaining the existence of everything, the universe, as theism, and it has one big old entity less, in one fewer entity in its explanation, and therefore we should prefer the naturalistic thesis or hypothesis. So I would completely agree, and I think that what you have to do when you introduce God into the mix is quite often do a load of mental contortions. Take the problem of evil that we were talking about earlier, is that so when you start with God, right, and God creates the universe, and then you look at all these things in the universe and you say, well, how everything that you see, everything that you experience, everything in existence has to be explained in light of God. Now, with naturalism, it doesn't at all. So I don't need to explain why I stub my toe in the morning. Shit happens. I don't need to explain why malaria exists. Shit happens. In fact, I can explain it on evolution. And if evolution doesn't work with theism, you've got a problem. Because we're looking around the world, looking at the world around us, and we can see evolution, or we can understand evolution, and evolution explains all sorts of things and fits with all sorts of other disciplines. And if that doesn't fit with God, then you have to do mental contortions. And what I'm trying to say is that when you posit God plus the universe, you have to explain everything in the universe in terms of God. And that's really difficult and often, I would argue, impossible, because you're trying to jump through hoops to justify the things you're seeing. You know, how do I explain the diversity of organisms in the world in light of God? And how do I explain carnivorous animals in light of God? Well, I can explain it using evolution, but how do I explain that using God if God is ultimately powerful and sovereign over everything that's designed and created? And you have to kind of think up reasons why evolution might exist in light of God, or why malaria might be. And it's just so, well, to me, it's so desperate and so unnecessary. Like, I don't need God in my life. And I don't mean from a practical point of view. I don't need God from a practical point of view as well. Like, on a daily basis, I have no need for God. This is like what Pierre-Simon Laplace said, famous French mathematician, I think he was. But he created like this book that explained everything and took it to Napoleon Bonaparte, the emperor, and said, here's my book. What do you reckon? And Napoleon Bonaparte sort of looked through it and said, why does this book not mention God? And I don't know if this is an urban legend, actually. I don't know if this definitely happened, but so it goes. It might be an attribution, but so it goes that Pierre-Simon Laplace said, I have no need for that hypothesis. And I just loved that. I used that in my free will book sort of 10 years ago, which is like, I don't need God to explain anything. Again, this was another thing I was going to talk about today. God is redundant as an explanation. As I said earlier, maybe consciousness, maybe the universe beginning are the only, that I think they're the only two things that I go, I wonder how that works. But I don't really for 1 minute go, I wonder how that works. It must be God. I go, I wonder how that works. And I've got a pretty damn good reason to think that it's naturalism that best explains that phenomenon, whatever it may be. And as I talked about earlier, based on inductive reasoning, but also based on all the frameworks of how we understand how the world works. We have no need for God to explain. And what's happened is when God used to, and I said this many times before, but when in 2000 years ago, during the biblical times, for example, or any whatever historical religio context you're talking about, God walked amongst people, right? And people use God to explain things. I wonder why that happened. Oh, God. And God became this etiological mechanism, which means a story to explain stuff. Thunder, lightning, floods. You got flood myths in every single religion. Why do floods happen? How do floods happen? God. Okay, so God was amongst us and God explained things around us. But then as we started understanding these things, God just moved back behind the mountain, back maybe above the skies, back beyond the stars. And now, really, for modern theists, God has been pushed back so far that God exists outside the known universe. God's not really necessary to explain anything in the universe. It's just out there to explain the universe as a whole, and is moved back to being a walking sort of, as you can see by the book there, an anatomy, God and an anatomy, which is all about explaining how God in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, walked amongst us and had an anatomy, is now just an abstraction. And this abstraction just explains a couple of unknowns for modern theists. This explains a couple of unknowns that humanity is struggling to explain totally and wholly. but as an abstraction, it's just some kind of philosophical idea that's out there as a kind of like go-to when we're struggling to explain stuff. But really, and that's it. And there's no need to posit that hypothesis. God has been pushed back and pushed back and pushed back to the point of near impotency and redundancy and irrelevancy. So God is not only irrelevant in my life, as I was saying, on a practical daily basis. I don't invoke God for anything. I don't pray to God. God just whatever. But I have no need for God in any kind of cerebral matter either. Trying to understand anything in the universe, I just have no need of God. And so this is the idea, is that God, the naturalistic world is simpler and equally well or better explains. And I would say better explains all the data around us, because when you try and explain a whole heap of data around us, like carnivorousness, naturalism does a better job of explaining carnivorousness, right? It's the fact that we all need energy. It's just we all need energy to survive. Theist has to go, well, why do we need energy to survive in light of God? And then you have to say, well, if we need energy to survive, and one of the best ways of getting energy quickly is by devouring other animals, right? Rather than eating a load of plants and then having to do that a lot and a lot, like, or whatever. I'm probably butchering like biology here. But the theist has to do these extra jumps, which is to say, now I've got to justify carnivorousness in light of an all-loving God, which is to say that, there must be some greater good that comes about from us murdering animals on a behemoth industrial scale around the world. That there must be a greater good. Whereas the naturalist says, well, shit happens, and we've got this scenario whereby we need energy, and that's how it's evolved. And we've got to a position now where it doesn't have to be how it is for humans. We can change our behavior, and we can get that same. We're clever enough now, and we can use our opposable thumbs and tool making hands and tool handling hands. And we can use our brains, and we can communicate because we can talk and pass information on over time and space. And we can do all these things, and we can work out how to solve these problems of gargantuan amounts of human carnivorousness. And so we can get around the problem, but naturalism just better explains everything. Whereas supernaturalism and this belief in omni-God, this all-loving God, you have to explain all of these ideas within another framework behind the universe, the mechanistic framework of the universe, this other framework of like an all-loving, all-knowing, all-loving, all-powerful God. Everything has to get explained. Carnivorousness, as I say, plate tectonics, right? We understand geology, and we understand that within a naturalistic framework of how the physical laws work and stuff like this. But the theist has to go, okay, I now have to explain why plate tectonics exist in light of an all-loving God, because they're killing untold amounts of people throughout history. And that's really difficult. So I think naturalism is a lot simpler, and does a lot better job of explaining the data we see around us. And theism struggles to explain pretty much everything. Like, it's just really difficult, because you have to think, why would a mind that is the ultimate mind create anything, create a worm that burrows into your eye and causes you blindness or whatever it is? Again, you have to explain every single thing. Every time a Christian or every time a theist moans about anything in the world, you just go, yeah, you've got to explain that in light of omni-God. So quit your whinging and explain that in light of omni-God. Whatever it is, why your wall fell over that you just built in your back garden. Yeah, explain that in light of omni-God, because it didn't need to happen, but it happened. Right, I can explain that through the laws of physics and naturalism. Can you explain that, given you love your all-loving God, and that still happened? Go figure. So I came on with very few I'm just talking. I'm just stream of consciousness here. So apologies if this is all complete nonsense. But, there you go. That's how I roll. Nidemos says, or Nidemos, or Nidemos, or Nidemos. Who knows? He knows, or she. Probably he, because the picture's he. Or is it? I don't know. Goodness me. God, why is every claim you make under skepticism? Like, this is the way my brain works. I like to challenge myself on literally everything I say. It's just really tiring. Life is so tiring when you're a skeptic. It's like, I've said a word. Have I said it correctly? I could say it in this way, this way, this way. And I've said it's a man, but it isn't a man. Is it a woman? I don't know. Whatever. My favorite way to show the absurdity is to point out that their allowance argument can justify all the way up to infinity minus one agent's suffering. Yeah. So I said this in another video, and I will say this again. Apologies. There's a lot of me repeating myself all the time if you watch all my videos, but if you don't, here you go. The problem of evil arguments, well, the theodicies as a way of defending God from the problem of evil arguments. The best way to do this is exactly what he's done here, which is to do the reductio ad absurdum, which is let's take it to the most absurd level you can possibly think and see if it still works. So what's the most absurd level? Well, let's say Nidemos here is the last human on earth, right? He believes in God. Really, really believes in God, is a completely, devoted follower of God. God then decides to take all of humanity and all living beings in the universe and torture them for 50 years in front of Nidemos, right? And tortures his family in front of him for 50 years. And then tortures Nidemos for another 1,000 years, right? Absolutely terrible torture. What a disgusting scenario. Just of mass pain and suffering. And the theist can still say there might be a greater good why that happens. So Nidemos is there getting tortured for 1,000 years after seeing his family killed and tortured and killed, and go, do you know what? There could be a reason that God could still be omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent. God could still be all loving. There might be, there conceptually could be a reason why this happens. And it's just like, it's completely unfalsifiable. It's just, there is no scenario, there's no amount of pain and suffering that can happen that can show that God doesn't exist. But so therefore we get to the probability argument, which is, well, what does this probably look like? And obviously it's a slightly weird scenario because you've got God doing the torturing, so of course God exists. But the point is, imagine you've got like untold amount of suffering on just insane scales, and you can still say, well, all loving God might exist. Well, yeah, unicorns could exist, but I'm not sure that does a good enough job to justify my belief in unicorns. I don't know if that's kind of what you were going on about there at all, but it's what I've said. So maybe this goes on. There is a stopping point that skeptical theists can produce once they start making concessions. Is there? There is no stopping point. I would say they make a concession up to the most ridiculous amount, and they're still in trouble. See my comment on Capturing Christianity's response to Drew of Genetically Modified Skeptic. Yes, I possibly. So the goalpost for the concession maker is like an oiled up chicken. You'll never hit it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So and yeah, I have got what he is saying, and indeed I did say no stopping point. I presume that's what you meant. So that's good. We're on the same page here. So excellent. The idea is that when I look at the universe, there is, to me, the naturalism is the simpler explanation. It's the better explanation. And then you start doing other things. So you can look at all these different arguments. You can look at cosmological arguments. You can look at moral arguments. You can look at all of these things. And then you get to this stage where you start looking at the actual details of any given particular religion. So I would say when you do all these, and going back to what real theology said earlier, and I presume that's Benjamin, but it might not be Benjamin Blatesby Watkins, who I interviewed a few weeks back. You look at the whole for me, it's pretty much cumulative. It's just throw it all in together. It's inductive arguments, it's deductive arguments, it's rational arguments, it's the best inference. You look at all of these things together and say, right, let's throw this all in, and what do we come up with? Well, naturalism. I don't pin one argument, pin all my hopes on one argument. Go, well, that's the best argument for. To me, it's just so. To me, it's obvious. Like, I've got to this point now where I've been doing this long enough where I just go, how can you still believe in God? How can you still believe in omni-God? I've just written a book. It's going to come out in the next couple of weeks. So, watch out for it, called 30 Arguments Against the Existence of God. And I put God in scare quotes because, you define this version of God and someone else, well, that doesn't apply to my God. My God's this God. And then this God, and you kind of play around like I was saying earlier. So I say, right, God I'm talking about is the omni-God, omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent, right? 30 arguments against that God existing, and also divine. So 30 arguments against the existence of God, divine design, heaven, hell, and Satan. So I've got all these arguments, and it's a lovely cumulative case, but it's just like, right, all of those arguments, they all work. I cannot believe that there are still clever people out there believing in this God. So when we're talking about deductive arguments, I really do think those arguments I produced in that book, and they're not new by any means. A couple of them have my own kind of slant on stuff, but it's stuff that's been around for a long time, right? But I just can't believe that people still flog that dead horse. That horse is dead and buried. Like, I don't get how you can still believe in this version of God, given its internal inconsistencies and external problems with how we look at the world and the suffering and all these kind of, I don't know. And of course, people still believe because of psychology, something I'm always banging on about, which is people can't be reasoned out of a position they're not reasoned into. And people believe in God because, what, they're brought up believing in God, and their family does, and their elders do, and their society, their community does. And then they spend the rest of their lives post hoc rationalizing that belief that they didn't rationally come to in the first place. So the reason why these arguments don't find purchase with them is because they believe for predominantly psychological reasons. And so we need to understand that if we're going to try and unpick those and disabuse them of the notion that God exists. But anyway, irrespective as to whether books like mine will ever do any good against committed theists, I enjoy writing them, and hopefully they're ammunition for atheists, and hopefully they will change people's minds. But what was the point I was making? The point was that I cannot believe that people still believe just in the abstract God understanding. And this goes, Rick Alter says here, the 6-day creation story is the hardest pill to swallow. But, this is why I'm talking about psychology. So you look at 6-day creationists. That's obviously not how the universe came to be. It's obviously not the best explanation of the data, right? It's so obviously not. So there's an awful lot of work that's been done by a load of psychology. And it's the same with conspiracy theories, like QAnon supporters. God, I could go and I could disabuse them of those notions with loads of rational arguments, but it's not going to touch the sides. They're still going to believe that crazy stuff because they want to believe it. And if you really want to believe it, you'll jump through hoops and do mental contortions to believe that. And, how do you stop those people believing that? I don't know that there's one easy answer to that, but I'm pretty sure it's wrapped up with a lot of psychology. I haven't read this yet, so let's see what Niduma says again. As Digital Gnosis pointed out recently, the people who throw these justifications around are sheltered, not experiencing the levels of suffering that they'd never agree are necessary. Really good point. So actually, you can draw that example out further by saying, and a lot of, and I know I'm going to be generalizing here a lot, but let's take your fundamentalist, quite right-wing fundamentalist conservative Christian, right, who is, say, anti-homosexuality, really homophobic. What's the best way of getting them to leave that particular kind of view behind? was to normalize homosexuality and for them to get to know people who are homosexual. And in fact, I've met people where this has been exactly what's happened. When they were really conservative Christians, this is a process they went to realizing that actually some of their views must just simply be wrong, because they've normalized, the ideas have been normalized by getting to know people. So as Digital Gnosis must have pointed out, going out and experiencing and seeing firsthand this suffering, going out and experiencing the variety of people and the existence of other religions, and the fact that, not all atheists are complete bastards, and going out and just experiencing the world is one of the best ways to loosen the grip that fundamentalist Christianity has on your heart and your mind. I don't know if that's where Nicodemus was going with that, but that's where I've taken it. So, deal with it. But no, thanks for that. It's, a really good point. So where was I going? Well, who knows? I'm probably going around in circles. Oh yeah, that's where I was going. So not only, mostly they come out at night. Mostly, bit of an aliens joke there. So not joke, reference. Tip of the hat. So the last area what I wanted to talk about is when you start going through these arguments, these deductive arguments and inductive arguments, then you get to the point where, okay, let's look at the particulars. Let's look at the Bible. Does the Bible work? And then when you analyze the Bible, like truly and honestly analyze it, and I know that's difficult, but theists will say the atheists are going to bring biases to the analysis table, and atheists are going to say, well, theists are Christians and Orthodox Jews are obviously biased, and whatever, you butt heads. But realistically, when you analyze, like I've done a book on the Nativity, so hopefully I know a little bit about what I'm talking about. I've done a book on the resurrection, and I'm writing a book on the Exodus, and none of it makes any sense. Not makes any sense. All of it is problematically, historically, theologically. It just all looks very parochial and very much like exactly what it is, which is, holy text developing out of a parochial time and place in a way that you'd expect it to, given the surrounding cultural milieu in which it's set. And these ideas develop, and then, over time, this is argued to be the exception. Like, this wasn't actually dependent upon all these things around it. It's just, it is what it is, and it's on its own perfectly encapsulates the truth. And no, it didn't develop, even though you're providing all this evidence to say that yes, it did develop. The covenant code did come from Lipa Ishtar and Unamu and the Code of Hammurabi and the Hittite law codes and all these other ones, right? I can see that you're saying that, but it didn't. It's perfect on its own, and I'm arguing for biblical exceptionalism. So, it's difficult. How do you disabuse someone of those kind of ideas? Well, you just go on and on until you built up such a corpus of work that completely wins the argument. Is that ever possible? That someone that doesn't want to be disabused of their false ideas. But so the last brick in the why I'm an atheist kind of wall might be the fact that all of these claims are so problematic. The history of the nativity, the history of the resurrection, theology of the nativity, the theology of the resurrection, the internal biblical contradictions, the multiple sources of the Hebrew Bible, the problem of not naming any sources of both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, the problem with the internal contradictions of the gospel writers, and differences with Paul, and the synoptic problem and the Johannine problem, and all these issues of like moral disgust within the Bible. You're like, do you know what? Atheism does a better job of just describing reality, and is so it's just far fewer instances where we have to jump through the hoop. We don't have to jump through any hoops. Just shit happens, and humans can be right bastards. But then, do you know what? If we work together and use we use a golden rule to as a rule of thumb to guide our behavior, then actually we can make things better. And let's try and make the world a better place by using moral reasoning rather than the 2,000-year-old book that tells me not to eat shellfish. And whatever. So yeah, I'm very close to starting to rant now. But anyway, I'm just about to finish up for today. I just thought this would be a nice quick. Unless you've got any questions, any super chats would be very, very generous. But any questions at all, get them in. Science is a good yardstick. Joshua never shouted to Yahweh to stop the sun, and it obeyed. I mean, yes, science is a great yardstick. When you look at things like in the resurrection and Matthew 20:27, is it? And you've got the sun disappearing for 3 hours, earthquake, zombie saints parading around Jerusalem, and the temple veil being ripped. And you're thinking, well, what explains that? Does science explain it? No. Okay, it's pretty crazy, it's supernatural, and it's pretty unbelievable. Why? Let's see who else tells us about these incredible events. Oh, no one. We only find them in one, or maybe with the darkness 2 and the veil 2 or 3 gospel accounts. Okay, and they all depend on each other. Okay, so we've got one source for this that fails when put up against a yardstick of science and what we know about how the world works. You need some pretty damn good evidence for that to be true. So what's the level of evidence you got? Oh, it's that, is it? Oh, the Gospels. Oh, the Gospel of Matthew. All right. So is that really, really good? Is that like top-notch evidence? Is this like, is Matthew naming his sources? No. Oh. Do we know who Matthew was? No. Oh. Do we know where he lived? Maybe, but not really. Oh, okay. So what historiographical techniques did he use? Oh, none. Okay. Did he have good reason to be biased? Absolutely. Oh, okay. So is this really good evidence to support the claims? No, absolutely not. Oh, okay. Well, then I won't believe the claims, if you don't mind, because I don't think I'm justified in believing the claims. And that goes for the rest of what's written actually in the entirety of the Bible. So Hebrew Bible and Christian. So there you go. Anyway, thank you very much for listening to me yabber on. I really wanted. I mean, I'm going to be interviewing Emerson Green, who has a great channel and podcast, Walden Pod and Counter Apologetics podcast, as well as his own YouTube channel, Emerson Green, and his Why I'm an Atheist. He looks at 5 areas which are broadly covered, albeit really, really quickly. He says we don't need God to explain anything. That's what I talked about at the beginning. 2, there are few phenomena that are better explained by theistic models than by atheistic models. I would argue there are no phenomena that are better explained by theism than atheism. There are many phenomena that are better explained by atheistic models than by theistic models. Absolutely. Theism is more metaphysically profligate than naturalism as an explanation. What that means is that theism throws in lots of extra entities that in order to explain the same data. That's what I was saying earlier, that actually atheism is simpler and naturalism is simpler. And theism suffers from various internal problems. That's what I was trying to say at the end, which is, let's look at the Bible, let's look at the Hebrew Bible, let's look at the Christian Bible, and there are just problem after problem there's problem after problem after problem. Satan, back in the zone. Satan, good to have you back. Just catching the end. Pine Creek says there are no good arguments for atheism because you can't demonstrate the non-existent. Well, that's an interesting way of looking at it. And this depends on really how you look at atheism. I'll have to think about that. That's an interesting comment. It's something I'd like to think about, so I won't give an answer straight away. Can you have a good argument for some? So, for example, instead of taking that, let's say arguments. There are no good arguments for unicorns not existing. Interesting. Well, the best argument for unicorns not existing is that we don't see them. We've never seen them. They appear to be mythological in nature. I'm just thinking off the top of my head, and there's no good reason to believe that they exist. And actually, going back to the theism one, there's no good reason to think theism exists. Again, going back to the simpler arguments for, the simplicity that naturalism has. So I don't know, maybe there are some of those unicorn arguments that you could apply to atheism, but that's definitely an interesting way of looking at it. Vaguely agnostic is such a good supporter. Thank you for this. Ain't no such thing as original sin. Elvis Costello. He's in the news recently for the lyrics in Oliver's Army, I think, wasn't he? Ain't no such thing as an original sin. Well, this much is true, definitely. Especially when the original sin was Adam and Eve eating from the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. How could they know that was a bad thing to do if they hadn't yet eaten from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? We have a huge problem here. Oh dear. So they're being told off. They're being punished. The original sin and the fall that we're all being punished for, supposedly, is this great moral command that they disobeyed, that they actually wouldn't have known was morally bad because they didn't yet know what was good or evil. So that's a real problem. But yeah, thank you, Vaguely Agnostic. Awesome. I heard a preacher say those zombies are still among us. We just don't know who they are. They could get onto philosophical zombies, P-zombies, as they're called in philosophy, which is, people who appear to look like just like other people, but might not have any experience, any kind of subjective experience or qualia. And so, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole, but yes, I wonder if they're zombie saints still among us. Throwing a demon at it always solves the problem. Okay. And just to finish off, Graham's here. Good to have Graham here. He's a good man. If a God is defined with contradictory properties, then proof by contradiction works. Exactly. And so this is why I spend a lot of time, again, to go back to the book that's just about to come out, which is 30 Arguments Against the Existence of God. This is a look at God, looking at the properties of omni, 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 and showing that they are just internally incoherent. And the idea that you can't be perfectly just and perfectly merciful, for example, I think is a direct contradiction. And I think you can quite conclusively show that these don't work together. And I don't think those, I love talking about omni-God, and that really floats my boat, probably more than anything talking about atheism, theism. It's the omni-God, all-loving, all-knowing, all powerful, that I think so many problems come out of. It's such rich pickings for doing some philosophy. So there you go. Going back to that idea that no good argument for an off button for a TV if you can't find a channel. There's no good argument for an off button on a TV. I'm not sure if that works. I'll have to think about that. Anyway, point being is hopefully I've talked about a little bit to do with why I'm an atheist, which is looking at, I wanted to just concentrate a little bit on the simplicity of the naturalistic atheistic arguments and show that the supernaturalism and God belief is actually multiplying entities unnecessarily and makes it more complicated. But also you have to jump through more hoops and you have to justify. And this is a key takeaway, really, is everything you see, particularly all the bad things you see, literally everything from stubbing your toe to malaria, has to be explained in light of God. But also things that might be a bit neutral, things like the behavior of this, like the property of this natural substance needs to be explained in light of God. If God's literally designed everything, then unless he's just like thrown his hands up in the air and gone random, like everything must exist for a particular reason. And so it's interesting to look at, why does the property of this, like given omni-God, why this, why that, which is easier for things like pain and suffering, tsunamis and plate tectonics. It's interesting. I pulled Dinesh D'Souza up on this years back. He said, well, people die in tsunamis and stuff, because that's how God had to create plate tectonics, because that's one of the best ways to create life. You know, without plate tectonics, you're not going to get this and this effect on a globe, and this and this effect is what helps life to start. You know, vents or whatever, the start of life. I don't know what his arguments were exactly, but I sent him an email saying, mate, you're absolutely wrong, and he wrote back to me. We had a bit of a ding dong with regard to this, and he was completely wrong, as he was on a couple of things I pointed him out on over time, because it's Dinesh D'Souza. But he was just basically saying that God had to make plate tectonics. Like, God wasn't powerful enough to create like a life-sustaining planet without plate tectonics, and so therefore he had to create plate tectonics, and therefore you had to have tsunamis where people die. It's like, and you believe in omni God? Seriously, mate? I mean, that's some weak ass arguing in my book, but there you go. Thank you to Rick. I'm going to sign off in a sec because I'm going to go and pick up my boys from school. But thank you so much, Rick. I enjoy your insights. I'm glad you do. I've literally been, apart from having a couple of quotes to draw from, Graham Oppy's, luckily, which is exactly what real atheology was sort of talking about. It's just been stream of consciousness. So if any of this made sense with my MS-addled brain, I'm more than happy. So thank you for popping along, people. Thank you to Vaguely Agnostic, who is today's favorite human being, but always so kind, so kind. So thank you for all of your support, peoples. Take it easy, question everything, particularly yourselves, and yeah, hit me in the comments with what you think are the best arguments for atheism, and maybe I can investigate them in future videos, and what you think might be the best arguments for theism as well. Especially if you're an atheist, what do you think is the most troubling argument, or what do you think is the thorn in your side? In probably, I would say the thorn in the side of theists is going to be the problem of evil, because it's so emotive and they have to explain all suffering in light of God. What do you think is the biggest problem for atheists? I don't know. Put it in the comments below. Please like, subscribe, and all of that stuff. Thank you so much for your support. And I will be producing videos again and interviewing people going forward. Check out the upcoming live streams. As I said, I've got Emerson Green. I've got Phil Zuckerman. I'm really excited about. That's fantastic. And others. So, you know, check them out. Come along, join in. Thank you. See you later.